AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator exam practice questions are available in the video for you to study. You have an Azure subscription that contains multiple virtual machines in the West US Azure region. You need to use traffic analytics in Azure Network Watcher to monitor virtual machine traffic. Which two resources should you create? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A data collection rule, OCR, in Azure Monitor. B. A log analytics workspace. C. An Azure Monitor workbook. D. A storage account. E. A Microsoft Sentinel workspace. The answer is BD. To use traffic analytics in Azure Network Watcher, you need to create a log analytics workspace and a storage account. A log analytics workspace is a cloud-based repository that collects and stores data from various sources, such as NSG flow logs. A storage account is a container that provides a unique namespace to store and access your data objects in Azure Storage. You need to enable NSG flow logs and configure them to send data to both the log analytics workspace and the storage account. Traffic Analytics analyzes the NSG flow logs and provides insights into traffic flow in your Azure cloud. You are configuring Azure AD authentication for an Azure storage account named Storage1. You need to ensure that the members of a group named Group1 can upload files by using the Azure portal. The solution must use the principle of least privilege. Which two roles should you assign to Group1? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Storage blob data contributor. B. Reader. C. Storage blob data reader. D. Contributor. E. Storage account contributor. The answer is AB. To ensure that the members of Group 1 can upload files by using the Azure portal, they need to have both data access and management access to the storage account. Data access refers to the ability to read, write, or delete blob data in the storage account. Management access refers to the ability to view the storage account resources in the Azure portal, but not modify them. The Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC, system provides built-in roles that encompass common sets of permissions for data access and management access. The Storage Blob Data Contributor role grants read, write, and delete access to blob data in the storage account. The Reader role grants view access to the storage account resources in the Azure portal. Therefore, by assigning both roles to Group 1, the members of the group can upload files by using the Azure portal. This solution also follows the principle of least privilege, as the group members are only granted the minimum permissions required to perform the task. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account. The account stores website data. You need to ensure that inbound user traffic uses the Microsoft Point of Presence (POP) closest to the user's location. What should you configure? A. Load balancing. B. Private endpoints. C. Azure firewall rules. D. Routing preference. The answer is D. Routing preference is a feature that allows you to configure how network traffic is routed to your storage account from clients over the Internet. By default, Traffic from the Internet is routed to the public endpoint of your storage account over the Microsoft Global Network, which is optimized for low latency path selection and high reliability. Both inbound and outbound traffic are routed through the point of presence, POP, that is closest to the client. This ensures that traffic to and from your storage account traverses over the Microsoft Global Network for the bulk of its path, maximizing network performance. You can also change the routing preference to use Internet routing, which minimizes the traversal of your traffic over the Microsoft Global Network, handing it off to the transit ISP at the earliest opportunity. This lowers networking costs, but may compromise network performance. Therefore, to ensure that inbound user traffic uses the Microsoft POP closest to the user's location, you should configure routing preference to use the Microsoft Global Network as the default routing option for your storage account. You have an Azure subscription that contains 20 virtual machines, a network security group, NSG, named NSG1, and 2 virtual networks named VNET1 and VNET2 that are peered. You plan to deploy an Azure Bastion basic SKU host named Bastion1 to VNET1. You need to configure NSG1 to allow inbound access from the Internet to Bastion1. Which port should you configure for the inbound security rule? A22, B 443, C 3389, D 8080. The answer is B. Azure Bastion is a service that provides secure and seamless RDP, SSH connectivity to virtual machines directly over TLS from the Azure portal or via native client. Azure Bastion uses an HTML5-based web client that is automatically streamed to your local device. Your RDP, SSH session is over TLS on port 443. This enables the traffic to traverse firewalls more securely. To allow inbound access from the Internet to Bastion1, you need to configure NSG1 to allow port 443 for the inbound security rule. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to migrate 50 virtual machines from VMware vSphere to the subscription. You create a recovery services vault. What should you do next? A. Configure an extended network. B. Create a recovery plan. C. Deploy an open virtualization application, OVA, template to vSphere. D. Configure a virtual network. The answer is C. To migrate virtual machines from VMware vSphere to Azure, you need to use Azure Migrate, which is a service that helps you assess and migrate your on-premises workloads to Azure. Azure Migrate uses an appliance that you deploy as an open virtualization application, OVA, template to vSphere. The appliance discovers the virtual machines and sends metadata and performance data to Azure Migrate. You can then use Azure Migrate to assess the readiness, cost, and sizing of the virtual machines for migration. You can also use Azure Migrate to replicate and migrate the virtual machines to Azure. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual machine named VM1. You plan to deploy an Azure Monitor Alert rule that will trigger an alert when CPU usage on VM1 exceeds 80%. You need to ensure that the alert rule sends an email message to 2 users named User1 and User2. What should you create for Azure Monitor? A. An action group. B. A mail-enabled security group. C. A distribution group. D. A Microsoft 365 group. The answer is A. An action group is a collection of notification preferences that can be used by Azure Monitor to send alerts to users or groups when an alert rule is triggered. An action group can include email recipients, SMS recipients, voice call recipients, webhook URLs, Azure functions, logic apps, and more. To send an email message to two users named User1 and User2 when CPU usage on VM1 exceeds 80%, you need to create an action group that contains their email addresses and associated with the alert rule. You have two Azure subscriptions named Sub1 and Sub2. Sub contains a virtual machine named VM1 and a storage account named Storage1. VM1 is associated to the resources shown in the following table. You need to move VM1 to Sub2. Which resources should you move to Sub2? A. VM1, Disk 1, and Netlint 1 only. B. VM1, Disk 1, and VNet 1 only. C. VM1, Disk 1, and Storage 1 only. D. VM1, Disk 1, Netlint 1, and VNet 1. The answer is D. When you move a virtual machine to a different subscription, you need to move all the resources that are associated with the virtual machine, such as the disks, the network interface, and the virtual network. You cannot move a virtual machine without moving its dependent resources. You also need to ensure that the target subscription supports the same region, resource type, and API version as the source subscription. You develop the following Azure Resource Manager (ARM) template to create a resource group and deploy an Azure storage account to the resource group. Which CMDlet should you run to deploy the template? A. New as tenant deployment. B. New as resource group deploy, ent. C. New as resource. D. New as deployment. The answer is B. The New as Resource Group Deployment CMDlet deploys an Azure Resource Manager template to a resource group. You can use this CMDlet to create a new resource group or update an existing one with the resources defined in the template. The template can be a local file or a URI. You have an Azure virtual machine named VM1 and an Azure Key Vault named Vault1. On VM1, you plan to configure Azure Disk Encryption to use a key encryption key, KEK. You need to prepare Vault. For Azure Disk Encryption, which two actions should you perform on Vault1? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Create a new key. B. Select Azure Virtual Machines for deployment. C. Configure a key rotation policy. D. Create a new secret. E. Select Azure Disk Encryption for volume encryption. The answer is AC. To prepare Vault1 for Azure Disk Encryption, you need to perform the following actions on Vault1. Create a new key. A key encryption key, KEK, is an encryption key that is used to encrypt the encryption secrets before they are stored in the key vault. You can create a new KEK by using the Azure CLI, the Azure PowerShell, or the Azure Portal 1. You can also import an existing KEK from another source, such as a hardware security module, HSM, 2. The KEK must be a 2048-bit RSA key or a 256-bit AES key 3. Select Azure Disk Encryption for volume encryption. This is an advanced access policy setting that enables Azure Disk Encryption to access the keys and secrets in the key vault. You can select this setting by using the Azure CLI, the Azure PowerShell, or the Azure Portal 4. You must also enable access to Microsoft Trusted Services if you have enabled the firewall on the key vault. You have an Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, cluster named AKS1. You need to configure Cluster Autoscaler for AKS1. Which two tools should you use? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. The set as AK's CMD let. B. The Azure Portal. C. The as AKS command. D. The Kubic1 command. E. The set Azure CMD let. The answer is BC. AKS clusters can scale in one of two ways. The cluster autoscaler watches for pods that can't be scheduled on nodes because of resource constraints. The cluster then automatically increases the number of nodes. The horizontal pod autoscaler uses the metrics server in a Kubernetes cluster to monitor the resource demand of pods. If an application needs more resources, the number of pods is automatically increased to meet the demand.